But what you should be mindful of is we see this significant effect from about November through to about January, February. But actually, interestingly, usually rhinovirus and adenovirus and coronavirus kick in about September, October. We normally then get flu. And then normally about now, we see the coronaviruses and the other viruses again. So some of the normal patterns are disrupted here. But it's a mistake, yes, to think, oh, actually, in places like Spain, because it's warmer, it's not just temperature that affects the circulation and the increase in the circulation of viruses.
So is that behavioral as well as to do with the UV?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of factors, isn't it? Transmission is a very interesting area. What increases your risk of getting this pathogen? Now, some people want to put it down to a single mode of transmission, like it's airborne, it's fomite, but actually surfaces. So, but actually the predominant mode of transmission is contact, which is close contact. And actually the evidence is starting to emerge that it looks like it's probably transmitted in multiple modes: orophycal, fomite surfaces, airborne, in a close contact. So what we've got a problem is people want to say it's a single mode of transmission, and therefore wherever you are, you're at risk. And we should change the debate to trying to understand where are you at more risk and where are you at less risk. And if you understood that, so for instance, if you're on the beach where it's clear it's less risk, and then you see mask mandates in Spain, like you've got to wear a mask on the beach, you suddenly go, man, we're certainly losing the perspective here on the evidence of where it makes a difference, if that's what we're going to go to. And I think the problem now is people have a risk perception problem in that they seem to want to take all risk to zero in the population.
So I'm just going to say, if you had the conch, if you could say, right, this is what we're going to do now, what would you change and how would you change it?
Yeah, so look, I wanted to say one of the things in my urgent care GP job is I go into care homes, I go into people's houses, and people have COVID around you, and you go in. And I understand when people get fearful, why you might go to a place and go, I'm not going to go in there. But actually, at some point, the problem is for people is many people haven't been outside the house, haven't been to work, haven't gone back to normal activities. And actually, what we're seeing is a group of people who are still highly fearful. What I think needs to happen now is we need to be clear about the messaging of what are your risks. And in understanding those risks, what are the benefits of the vaccine program? And then still share that with people to say, yeah, your risk is never going to go to zero.
Are you happy with the fact that younger people are taking up, given that we don't have long-term data on it?
Well, the second issue then is to ensure you are transparent about the evidence base, the benefits and the harms. And in doing that, you fully inform people. And I think that would be an important development out of all this, is to say, yes, we've developed vaccines in a record time. There's been some amazing science go on, but it doesn't stop just because you produce the vaccine. Accumulating evidence is incredibly important. So, for instance, it may be that actually what you find, and this is the case, if you give a drug to everybody or a vaccine to everybody, sometimes there's a susceptible population who are at risk of complications. If you continue to develop the evidence base, you can highlight that and find out who they are. Are they certain types of people with certain problems?
Are we comfortable with vaccinating children, for example, at this point, given that we don't have long-term data?
So I think the thing is for children is there are studies that are ongoing, and there needs to start with the randomized controlled trials. And those randomized controlled trials need to be completed, and they need to be followed up for a period of time.
Should we be doing studies on children, given the...
Yeah, look, if you have an evidence void...
But do children need to be vaccinated is the point. Why do they need... Their risk is zero, or pretty much zero, that unless they have underlying conditions. So why would you be adding a potential risk that we don't know about to a child that has zero risk of something?
Well, the first thing to establish is, are there any benefits?
Exactly. Are there any benefits to vaccinating
Yeah,
healthy
you can
children?
only do that through a clinical trial. If we don't do that, we'll end up sitting here having this debate for many years, and somebody at some point will have an opinion where they say we should do it. So wherever we are, if we can, the only time not to do research is if you consider there is an equipoise. So there's clearly harms that would occur and no benefits. Yeah, so look, there are sort of benefits and harms to everything we do in terms of intervention. What's clear though, and I think this is an important point, what I can't say to you is we shouldn't investigate something when there's potential equipoise and there's uncertainty about what to do. And so I can't tell you that we can use an evidence-based approach and my opinion is more important than somebody else's, because a group of people believe that we should do it and there are benefits, and there are a group of people who believe there are harms and we shouldn't do it. I can be hugely controversial by saying there's only one way to answer that, by doing a trial. And in doing the trial, if you do it well, it's the best available evidence, you'll be able to inform the decision. In the absence of that, you've got a huge problem. And we'll just end up in these arguments. And I suspect at some point a policy will win out where we say just do it anyhow, just in case. And that's what we tend to see in an evidence void, because some voices will lobby for it to be done.
Yeah.
Now, all I'm saying is let's do the research.
So looking down the track, vaccine passports, you don't like the idea of that by the sounds of it, because you think it should be a choice, and vaccine passports sound like they verging on coercion.
Yeah, look, I think there will be issues globally with vaccines when they come around to it. I think just like we see with other vaccines like yellow fever, there will come a point where if you want to travel to certain countries, particularly where they've had not much impact, such as New Zealand, Australia, they'll require you to have the vaccine. So there'll be these sorts of backdoor approaches. But the idea that we have health information that I share with somebody to gain access to somewhere has all sorts of connotations for me that becomes a problem. How are people going to use my information? Where are they going to store it? What are they going to use it for? There are data protection issues on my behalf that I think are important. Second is you'll have all of these problems where the technology works, but the reality on the ground is a huge problem. Therefore, again, if you were going to do passports, what's the outcome of interest that you're going to come out with? What are you hoping to achieve? You could actually study passports in a controlled area. You could say, look, we're going to trial it in this area. We define an outcome. You set out the evaluation and you tell us what's going to happen. But what's the tendency here is to keep intervening with policy after policy after policy. I mean, I've lost count of the number of policies. If you go to certain parts of this country, like Oldham or Leicester, they'll basically tell you they've never been out of lockdown. If you remember, you go back to last summer, people forgetting, in Leicester and Oldham, when cases were were about 50 per 100,000, they were having mass screening, tier-free restrictions, all sorts of interventions, mailing out to the people, telling them what they should and shouldn't do. And do you know what? It's had no impact because they've ended up in the same place as all the other areas that were in similar positions. So I think we'll have the second dose out to the over 70s by mid-May. So I think that's the point where we should be returning to normality.
What does that mean for you?
Well, I think normality is you remove the masks, you remove the social distancing. I think there are one area where we have to be, a couple of areas where we just have to be mindful and try and understand what's the impact. And they're the sort of mass gathering events. And I think that's right to trial and evaluate them and say, what's the impact of these events in this way?
And what do you think will happen? I mean, I can see a good, there's lots of people who would agree with you. What do you think would happen, will happen looking down the track? Do you think we will see this return to normality, or do you think we'll continue to see more policies, and why?
Yeah. So I think, going into this pandemic, there was a lot more sensible thoughtfulness and reasoning about what to do and what not to do. And if you look, what's happened is in the middle of last summer is started to go wrong when people said cases are coming down, which they do anyhow in summer because of the seasonal effect. We can drive it to zero. And that's where the zero COVID movement come. And if you remember and you think back, we were going to be back to normal by November.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister was saying we'll be in the workplace and everybody will be back and everything will be open and functioning. And we were saying and advising the government going, come September, you're going to start to see the rise of infection. That's one of the issues. So that's what I was saying you should think about. I also said things like care homes. I said it's complex. It's difficult to manage. Why have you not got, for instance, a minister for care homes? Because it needs a special person who thinks about it and advises and inputs to the government, because I think it's so complex. We're talking about 500,000 people, but we are talking about a third of the problem. That was some of the issues I talked about. But I also talked about one particular problem, which was hospital-acquired infections, which is a huge problem. And it has been throughout this pandemic.
Why?
Well, at times, what happens is that you go into hospital for something else, and then at day 7, after day 7, about 20%, 1 in 5 people are catching it while they're in hospital. Now, the problem is those people tend to be the sickest already, otherwise they would have been discharged. So they tend to be unwell people. And if they get coronavirus, they then get severe disease and it increases mortality. And data out of Scotland shows that people, they account for nearly 2/3 of the people with severe COVID. You mentioned one person there who was speaking about diagnostics. I mean, Professor John Deeks is a perfect person I would have been telling me, red teaming, checking my assumptions. He'd be the person who I'd want to be on my shoulder, telling me whether he thinks it's a good idea or not. Because if he questions that issue, there's likely to be something that you have to do differently. Yeah, and they're the sorts of people, there's quite a lot of them are out who are peripheral, who should be brought in to improve the decision making.
Yeah, he's questioned the lateral flow test, hasn't they? And there's been concern that we'll end up in a purgatory of lockdowns if we, with so many false positives when infection rates are low. So he has been sort of silenced, and I know he's been, had problems getting that message out. Why do you think?
It's a very good example. You see, I've known for 20 plus years. He's worked in diagnostics, so it's not like he's overnight come and said, I have an idea, or here's what I'm looking at. That's been his experience and expertise for 2 decades plus.
The whole government's own advisory board was bypassed. I mean, why is that happening?
Well, I've often seen when we went to the last pandemic, is one of the things is that at times it seems in a policy initiative, what you have to be seen to be doing is doing something. Doing nothing is not an option. And it's a problem. And I wonder if it's got worse within the news cycle of the 24/7 news cycle of this is actually being supported. So people, because you're doing something, whether it works or not is immaterial. The fact is we're being seen to be doing something. And I see that often in policy and often in issues in lots of healthcare. And actually, this is the point where the whole of the message is the problem with that in health is when you're doing something and you're not sure, you could be creating harm or you could be creating benefit. But actually, many people are saying to you, you could also be wasting resources, huge amounts of money. For instance, we're spending more on testing than we are on the social care budget. Imagine if you took all that money and said, we're going to put it into social care. Would you derive more benefit because you put billions into care homes and social care and people's care? So in fact, every single person could have one carer instead of one carer looking after 20.
The policies that you think have possibly done more harm than good, aggressive testing now, mask mandates in schools now, for example, these are the things you've questioned. Do we know that they're doing more harm than good, or are you saying that at this point we just need to test them because we don't know?
Well, look, I think what we've said is wherever your policies are, you end up in a pretty similar situation. The question is, which areas of society do you think we've potentially done the most harm in having a year of dysfunctional arrangements in society? So number one on the priority list has to be children and getting them back to a normalization of life and society. And so right through from schools into university, we've got to get some normality going quick, because these are the people who are going to sort out the mess in the future. Second is, I think we have to be mindful of the impact in the economy, because the economy is linked to healthcare. Doesn't what you look at, if you increase the proportion of people who become less well off, who go into worse social deprivation, your health will plummet in that group. And so you have to be mindful of that. There are some structural things that we've got problems with in the UK. And one of them seems to be our lack of bed capacity in the NHS. Under 100,000 beds in England for 57 million people just doesn't seem to me to make sense. And one of the issues is we see policies when you think about it, and it's been so much. We've had all of the Nightingale hospitals not used, but actually we don't need these big super centres. They were put up almost for show, hundreds of millions of pounds wasted, but actually we need about 20% extra capacity when we go into winter somehow, because otherwise we'll become hostages in the middle of winter.
And if the government doesn't bring in different advisors who look at the problem differently, then it seems almost inevitable that we'll have more lockdowns, because we'll run into next winter and we'll have a problem and we won't have enough beds. And what do? What have we done before, which is locked down?
Yeah, so the current health secretary is the 12th health secretary while I've been a doctor in post. There'll come a point when he's gone and somebody replaces him. When I started in the NHS, we were spending 37 billion on the whole system. 2 decades later, we're spending about 140 billion and growing. And actually, if you'd have said to me, that increasing spending over more than 100 billion in the next 2 decades, you're still going to be faced with the exact same problems you were 2 decades ago. I would have just said that's implausible. It can't happen. But actually, we've seen many areas of care where we put money into low value activities. And often we've not fixed some of the structural problems. But one of the issues is anybody who says, I'm going to fix it in the next 3 to 6 months, basically I would ignore. If the people thinking about it don't look long term, and that's the problem, because there's an evolution, a rapid evolution of politicians who come and go really quickly. And actually, we do need some systems thinking that's radically different to what we're doing now. Well, look, we've got structural problems now. We've got a huge amount of backlog to catch up on, whether that's cancer screening, tests, diagnosis, operations, in the millions to be caught up with. All of that's a huge problem. Second is, even despite that, you've got the problem now with the world we live in. If we're not going to tolerate any risk, we're going to have huge problems in how we go forward, in terms of we'll see more people being put in hospital, not less. Because if you want to be risk averse, I can send general practice, can put many more people into hospital just in case. So all of that together. And in fact, if I wanted to see one thing change, and I'm deeply conflicted because I am a clinician, is I'd like to see clinicians at the forefront of leading and designing the service. For instance, if we're talking about cancer, you should be able to get same-day access services. You should be able to be seen within days, not 18, 20 weeks, which is currently the norm. That's what improves outcomes. We should not accept that actually our elderly people get substandard care when actually we've seen the price we have to pay when that occurs. So we've got to change the nature of the debate here. And if we come out of this and do that differently, but remember, it's never as simple as a single intervention like let's just lock down. It is complex and it needs a high quality evidence base to inform it.
And just last question, would you set up or have a body response looking at the harms of lockdown? Because we don't really, people pop up and do bits of research on cancer or heart disease or mental health, but actually we haven't really balanced this throughout the pandemic. Would you want to see something?
Yeah, I've been surprised that actually somebody like NICE has not had much more of a role in the decision-making strategies here, because they can really help and inform. And if you look at, they've been around since 2000, 2 decades, and have been a really effective innovation in understanding which medicines and which drugs should we pay for and use and which ones shouldn't we do. And many of them, because it costs too much, And it's right, something costs too much. It's about where you might use that money elsewhere. It's not you saying don't use that money. You might say, look, if we don't use the money in the testing tracing because there are no benefits, we're going to use it over here in social care where the benefits are.
Yeah. And in that, just in summary, do you think that we've done them good? I know it's a big question by locking down for so long and on such a level. Do you think that overall it wasn't worth it?
One of the most important aspects I say is, and I've worked with a lot of politicians and still do, is my job is to inform the decision, not to be the decision, and communicate what the evidence is saying, reflect the uncertainties, ultimately requires the politicians to make decisions. What I consider throughout this pandemic is they've had a problem getting to the benefits and the harms and the information and the evidence that can inform their decision. We live in a world where there's very polarized views about what to do next. Some people believe we should stay in lockdown and they present evidence that way, and other people are saying let's come out immediately, and that's a very two opposing views. What we need is decisions that reflect more in the middle and reflect all of society, so that everybody can say we're reflecting the benefits and the harms. So for instance, if we stay in lockdown, how does that impact on children? How does it impact on their mental well-being, their impact in society? And that's how you should make decisions, and that's how we should make them going forward at this moment in time.
I think you probably, you've run well over. If we need to top up, I can't think of anything. It's absolutely brilliant to talk to you. And thank you so much. I'll speak to you again. And thanks for everything. Okay, thank you. Bye. Bye.